Do you ever get to the end of the day and realize you've done everything, absolutely everything for everyone else and have nothing left for yourself? Do you find yourself going through the motions, ticking the boxes, but feeling oddly empty behind it all? Or perhaps you used to feel passionate about your work, your family, your life, and now you just feel flat. If any of that sounds familiar, this episode is for you. But before we get into that, I would like to give a very warm welcome to another episode of the Talk Room series of podcasts. I'm delighted to be joined today, as always, by Ian. Ian is a senior accredited National Counselling and Psychotherapy Society member and the founder of Hope Therapy and Counselling Services, a counselling and coaching organisation offering support throughout the entire UK for individuals, couples, and workplace clients across a wide range of mental health concerns, including those who identify as LGBTQIA plus and those who are neurodivergent. Ian, wonderful to have you with us again.
Thank you very much, as always, Wendy, and always genuinely lovely to be here. And let me introduce you to anyone joining us for the first time. Wendy is a highly experienced CBT psychotherapist who's been working in the field of mental health and well-being for well over 35 years now. Her depth of knowledge and clinical experience make her an absolutely outstanding person to explore this really important subject with. I always come away from our conversations having thought about something in a very different way. So thank you for that, Wendy, and lovely to be here.
Thank you, Ian. That's very kind of you. Now, today's topic is burnout. And I want to say up front that we're taking a deliberately broad view of this today because burnout isn't just something that happens to people with demanding careers. It happens to parents, to carers, to people who give and give across every area of their lives. We're also going to cover how burnout shows up, why it's so easy to miss, what actually helps, and when it might be time to reach out for professional support. Ian, before we dive in, we actually explored anxiety in a recent episode, and burnout and anxiety are closely related. Is that right?
They really are, Wendy. And if anyone hasn't listened to that episode yet, I'd encourage people just to go back and give it a listen because the two topics sit very much alongside each other. Burnout often has an anxiety component running beneath it, and anxiety can both cause and be caused by burnout. So today we're looking at burnout as its own distinct experience, but the companion episode is really worth people's time.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that, Ian. I appreciate that. So let's start at the beginning. Burnout is a word that gets used a lot, but I'm not always sure it's very well understood. So, what actually is burnout and how is it different from just being very stressed or very tired?
Yeah, and that's exactly the right question to start with, Wendy, because the confusion between stress and burnout is part of why so many people miss it in themselves. Stress and burnout are very much related, but they're meaningfully different as well. So stress is generally characterized by too much pressure, too many demands, too much to do. It's intense, but there's usually a sense that if things calm down, you'd recover from it. Burnout is a little different. Burnout is characterized by too little energy, too little motivation, too little meaning. It's a state of profound depletion. And crucially, people in burnout often don't feel the intensity of stress anymore. They just feel that sense of being empty, of being flat, of being disconnected.
Okay. Okay, so thank you for explaining that, Ian. And I'm just wondering if stress is like running on empty at high speed, would you say burnout is like the engine cutting out entirely?
That's a really good way of putting it, Wendy. So, the World Health Organization formally recognized burnout in 2019. They recognized it as an occupational phenomenon. They describe it as resulting from chronic stress that hasn't been successfully managed. But what the team and I at Hope see clinically is that burnout extends well beyond the workplace. We see it in parents who have been running on empty for years, in carers who have subordinated their own needs completely to someone else, in people who are high functioning in every external area of their life, but privately feel like they're not, that they've got nothing left. The common thread isn't a job, it's the relentless expenditure of energy without adequate recovery.
That makes a lot of sense to me, Ian. Yeah, I can see the difference there. And I'm just wondering, when did burnout start being recognized as a genuine clinical concern rather than just a trendy way of saying you're tired, for example?
The concept of burnout was first described by the psychologist Herbert Freudenberger back in the 1970s, who noticed it in volunteers who were working in demanding caring roles. But it's really in the last couple of decades that the research has really started to catch up with how widespread it is. In 2023, Gallup did a survey and found that about 76% of employees experience burnout on their job at least sometimes, and nearly a third say that they feel burned out very often or always. And those are really extraordinary figures, aren't they? And importantly, burnout doesn't just feel bad. It has measurable effects on physical health. It has measurable effects on cognitive function and also on the immune system as well. So it's not just a soft, trendy topic. This really is something that is tangible, that is evidence-based and is observable.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. And really, honestly, those numbers are so striking, aren't they? Amazing. Yeah, gosh. So I think what you're saying is burnout is legitimate, it's widespread, and it has real consequences. So I'm wondering, what are the three core dimensions of it that clinicians look for in burnout, would you say?
Yeah, so the framework that's most widely used in clinical settings identify three dimensions. And the first is exhaustion, and that's not just physical tiredness, but it's a bone deep depletion of emotional and mental resources. The second is what's called depersonalization or cynicism. It's a detachment from the things and people that used to matter. People describe feeling robotic. They feel as though they're going through the motions. They're losing the ability to care in the way that they used to. And the third is a reduced sense of personal efficacy, the feeling that nothing you do makes a difference, that your efforts are pointless. And when all three things are present, you're in the territory of significant burnout.
Mm. Okay, that's really interesting again. Thank you so much for that information. And what's my next question? My next question is, so who is most at risk? Because there's a stereotype of the burned out city worker, but I think what you're saying that is nowhere near the whole picture. Is that right?
Yeah, and actually, the stereotype is really incredibly unhelpful
Yeah.
because it stops a lot of people recognize what's going on within themselves, what's happening to them. And in my experience, in the experience of different members of the Hope team, this is very much reflected in the research. There are several distinct groups who are particularly vulnerable, and many of them would never describe themselves as the burnout type.
Okay. Okay. It's interesting. Yeah. Okay. So let's just go through them then. And who's the first group you'd identify? Where should we start?
So the first group is the high achiever and the perfectionist. So people who set extremely high standards for themselves and find it almost impossible to do things to anything less than an exceptional standard. And we both come across those people in therapeutic settings, don't we? They
Yeah.
tend to take on more than is realistic. They struggle to delegate. They feel profound discomfort with anything they perceive as failure or as inadequacy in any way. They keep pushing long past the point where their body and their mind are signaling that they need to stop. And what the team and I at Hope see with this group is that they're often the last to seek help because admitting that struggle feels like confirming a failure of some description, and they just can't accept that.
I can understand that. Yeah, very much. And I think that really resonates with CBT perspective as well, cognitive behavioral therapy perspective, the perfectionism that comes with that, and the rules, the rigid rules about what they should, the shoulding be able to cope with. And that makes a lot of sense to me. Okay. So what about the next group then? What group is that?
The next group I would say is the caregivers and the parents. And I want to be really specific here because I think this group is chronically underserved in the burnout conversation. So, whether you're raising a child, you're caring for an elderly parent, whether you're supporting a partner, maybe with a mental or a physical health condition, or maybe you're doing all three simultaneously, the demands can often be relentless. The labor is largely invisible, and there's often enormous guilt attached to acknowledging your own need. Parental burnout, in particular, has received growing research, actually, and is now understood to be a distinct clinical phenomena in its own right. So, not just tiredness, it's recognized as being its own distinct clinical categorization. And the symptoms include emotional exhaustion, specifically in that parenting role, a sense of being a different, a lesser parent than you want to be, and a detachment from your child or from your children that cause immense shame.
Oh, yeah. Oh dear, my heart goes out to parents, and especially when you feel shame, that the shame is so important, isn't it? And it's just so damaging because it can often stop people from talking about it and seeking help. Do you think that's the case, Ian?
Exactly that. Exactly that. And a third group is people in what we might describe as helping professions. And that might be a healthcare work, it might be a teacher, it might be a social work, it might be therapists, it might be emergency service personnel. It's a really wide range of people that might come under this sort of general heading. And those roles involve sustained emotional labor and repeated exposure to other people's distress. That sense of compassion fatigue that we hear people talk about, which overlaps significantly with burnout and is extremely common in those types of professions. And there's still a troubling culture in many of them that just treats that burnout as a sense of personal weakness rather than an occupational hazard.
That's so true, Ian. It really is. And you can be so much harder on yourself have higher standards. And you wouldn't say that to a person you're supporting, but you carry those high standards yourself. And I'd add from a CBT perspective, people who have typical strong people pleasing tendencies and also find it very difficult to set limits on what they take on. For example, the inability to say no, I would say, is also a significant burnout risk factor. Do you
A-
agree with?
Absolutely, absolutely. And that often connects to really deep-seated beliefs about self-worth, being conditional on being useful to other people, which is absolutely something that therapy can support and address in a really effective way. I'd also just like to highlight people navigating significant life transitions as well. And that might be things like redundancy or bereavement. It might be things like relationship breakdowns. It might be moving. It might be new parenthood. And those events demand enormous adaptive resources. And if someone was already running low before that transition hit, burnout can follow remarkably quickly in those instances.
Absolutely, yeah, that's so true, Ian. I totally agree with that. And also, maybe also neurodivergent individuals, ADHD, autism. I know from clinical experience that the additional cognitive and the sensory demands of masking, for example, and trying to navigate a world which is not designed for that particular individual, that can be such an enormous and often invisible load for the person to take on board as well.
A really important point to make there, Wendy. The energy cost of masking, of constantly adapting your natural way of being to fit neurotypical expectations can be genuinely exhausting in a way that others just don't see. And it's something that the team here at Hope are very conscious of in the way that we work. Burnout in neurodivergent adults is significantly underdiagnosed because it can present differently and because the underlying cause often isn't identified.
Okay, yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, it's amazing. It's good to hear that. It's good to hear that and understand that. So when you're working with some with neurodivergence, you can look out for that as well, can't you? Okay, it's really good, Ian. Okay, so slightly different question then. So Ian, how does burnout, how does it present itself? Because I think one of the most important things for our listeners to understand is why it's easy to be in burnout without naming it as such.
And this is something that I feel very strongly about because the gap between what's actually happening and what people think is happening is often enormous. The single most common thing I hear from people who are burned out is some version of, I don't know what's wrong with me. They don't connect the dots between the exhaustion, the emotional numbness, the resentment, and the physical symptoms because they're attributing each of them to different cause. The stomach issues are stress. The sleep problems are just a phase. The irritability is because of a difficult thing that's going on at work. The flatness is just because I'm tired. And it's when you put them all together that the picture becomes much, much clearer.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, Ian. Yeah, thank you for that. So I'm just wondering, what are the emotional and psychological signs that you would want people to recognize in burnout?
For me, the emotional exhaustion is the absolutely central one. It's that feeling of being completely drained, that sense of feeling drained and it doesn't lift with rest. People describe waking up in the morning and they're already tired, as if they've never really recovered overnight. Alongside that, there's often a creeping cynicism or emotional detachment. Things that used to matter can stop mattering. Work that used to feel meaningful can start to feel pointless. People you care about feel like they require more than you have to give. And there's often a loss of enjoyment in things that previously brought you pleasure, what clinicians and counselors and therapists often refer to as anhedonia, which is often is a key feature of depression as well. And there's frequently a sense of just going through the motions, performing a version of yourself rather
Mm.
than actually being present.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes complete sense as well, Ian, when you describe it that way. Yes. And what about the behavioral signs, the things that people do or stop doing even? What about them?
Really good question. And I think withdrawal is a really big one. People pull back from social connections, from hobbies, things they used to find energizing, partly because socializing requires a certain amount of energy that maybe they don't have, and partly because they feel disconnected in a way that makes social engagement feel hollow in some way. Productivity often paradoxically declines. People in burnout frequently describe spending enormous amounts of time feeling like they're working without actually getting anywhere at all. And the cognitive capacity for focus and decision making is genuinely impaired. And there's just often an increase in avoidance, putting off tasks, putting off doing that email, putting off having that conversation, which just creates a backlog and then feeds further into that sense of overwhelm and that sense of guilt that they may already be feeling.
Absolutely, yeah, yeah, that's so true, isn't it? And also the physical dimension, because I think people just simply underestimate how much burnout lives in the body. How do you feel about that one, Ian?
Yeah, yeah, really significantly, Wendy. So that sense of chronic fatigue that just isn't explained by sleep patterns, frequent illness. Burnout suppresses our immune function, so people find themselves getting every cold, every virus that's going. They get headaches, they get muscle tension, digestive issues, disrupted sleep, and often the cruel paradox of being utterly exhausted but unable to sleep, or sleeping really long hours and waking up completely unrefreshed. Some people will describe feeling heart palpitations or of physical restlessness alongside the mental flatness that we've talked about. Appetite can change for some people, either losing interest in food or using eating as one of the few remaining sources of comfort or pleasure. And something the team and I at Hope notice consistently is that many clients come to us having seen their GP, maybe multiple times
Yeah.
on occasions, for physical symptoms before the mental health picture is really understood and really start to be identified.
Yeah, that's such a clinically important observation, isn't it? And that's so frustrating when people have to go to the doctors again and again. There's no clear diagnosis, but the symptoms are very real, aren't
Yeah,
they? And they're very
absolutely.
well
Absolutely.
so the frustration is stressful enough trying to get a GP appointment, but actually coming out with nothing can, or a pill can be very frustrating. And I'd like to add just one more thing from compassion focused therapy, the inner critic. So I think I'm right in saying in burnout, the self-critical voice that we have inside our head becomes very loud. So it's, I should be doing better. I should be coping better. Other people manage this. What's wrong with me? And that voice both reflects the burnout and it just makes everything significantly worse.
Absolutely. And we both see that, and the Hope team regularly say exactly the same thing. And it's one of the cruelest features of burnout. The very state that depletes your resources also depletes the compassion that we
Mm.
feel for ourselves.
Yeah, that's so true, Ian. Yeah, that's so true. And just hearing this and noticing that, I think might help people to be aware of it and change. as well. So let's just turn now to what people can actually do about this. So, Ian, where do you start with someone who's recognizing burnout in themselves?
The first and most important thing is just recognition, naming it, because burnout tends to perpetuate itself through that sense of denial. So the same drive and determination that contributed to the burnout often prevents people from acknowledging it. So the act of saying, I am burned out, this is real, it needs addressing, is genuinely the first therapeutic step. It shifts the frame from I'm weak and failing to I'm running a deficit and I need to address it. And it's that fundamental different starting point that we really need to try to get to.
Yeah. Rather than blaming and shaming, it's recognizing and then addressing, isn't it? And from a CBT perspective, I would say that's directly challenging the thought patterns and noticing what they are and being more aware of the thought patterns, the ones that keep people stuck. Okay, so first step is recognition. What comes after that, Ian?
The second step is a genuine audit of where your energy is going, because most people in burnout have never actually mapped this out. What I do is I encourage people to look at their life across all domains. So, across work, across family, across caring responsibilities, across social obligations, and ask honestly, what is draining me? And then, what is nourishing me? And what's the ratio between the two? So, what is draining me or depleting me, and what is nourishing me? And trying to get a sense of the ratio between those two things. And for most people in burnout, the ratio is catastrophically imbalanced. And the insight from doing that exercise alone is oftenly genuinely shocking to clients that I work with. Because when you see it laid out, the idea that you can just push through becomes clearly impossible.
Yeah, that sounds like a really good, very useful exercise to do. Yes, I'll have to do that myself, I think. Okay, and then the next step, what about rest? What about the role of rest? Because I think there's a common misconception that rest simply means sleep. Is that right?
Absolutely that. So that's a really important point to make. And there's an excellent piece of work done by researchers, Sherry and Alex Sujung Kim Pang, on what they call restorative activities. And the key insight is that not all rest is equally restorative. Sleep matters enormously and shouldn't be compromised. But passive rest, like scrolling through social media or watching TV whilst half engaged, is often not genuinely restorative. So, what tends to replenish depleted resources is what researchers call effortless attention. So activities that engage you gently without demand. Being in nature is one of the most consistently evidenced. Creative activities done without performance pressure. So physical movement that you actually enjoy rather than endure. Time in genuine social connection with people who don't require you to perform. So the question to ask yourself isn't, am I resting, but is what I am doing
Mm.
restoring me?
Yeah, I love that distinction, Ian. I think that's such an important part because don't we all scroll or half watch the telly or we're thinking that we're resting and we're not really resting at all? I think that's a really good point there. And again, I'm going to take that on board. Okay, so what about the role of limits? Because I think for many people in burnout, The inability to set limits on what they take on, I believe, is just so absolutely central to how they got there. What about that idea?
It's central to both the cause and the recovery. Yes, absolutely. I think we need to be realistic here. Saying no is genuinely difficult for many people, and it's not just a habits issue. For some people, it's connected to deep belief about their sense of worth being contingent in some way on their usefulness. For others, it's fear of conflict or not wanting to let people down or having never been modeled healthy limit setting in the past. So, whilst just say no more sounds simple, for many people, it requires really genuine work to understand why saying no feels so threatening and before the behavior can meaningfully change.
Hmm. Yeah. And I think that's where CBT therapy can be really particularly valuable, just exploring and then ideally challenging those sort of beliefs underneath, the underlying beliefs. And they're so important, aren't they? Not just trying to change the surface behavior. Okay. And then my next question goes on to the physical side. What can we do physically to aid recovery?
Again, a really important question. And the basic physical regulation is foundational. And I say this not to be reductive, but because it genuinely is the ground floor. Without it, everything else becomes harder. So, sleep, nutrition, movement are the three pillars. Sleep, as I mentioned, is absolutely non-negotiable. The research on sleep deprivation and its effect on emotional regulation, on cognitive function, and physical health is absolutely unequivocal. Nutrition matters more than people realize. When they're depleted, the brain consumes an enormous amount of energy and isn't well served by skipping meals and really high sugar intake. And movement, not punishing exercise, but genuinely enjoyable movement is one of the most effective interventions we have for both the emotional and the physical dimension of burnout. There was a study done in 2020 that was in the Journal of Affective Disorders, which found that even low intensity physical activity can significantly reduce burnout symptoms. So it's not about 3 hours in the gym every day, and that's the good news for people.
Yeah, and important to hear that. And I love that idea of actually doing enjoyable movement, things that you enjoy. It's just a whole new dimension rather than having all the oughts that we feel so much. Okay. And then I'm just wondering about another area. I'm wondering about connection, because I'm just wondering whether burnout tends to make people withdraw, but really what they need is connection. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, it's one of the most painful paradoxes of burnout. The very thing that would help being genuinely seen and supported by people who care about you can for so many people feel almost impossible when you're really depleted. You have nothing to give to conversations. You don't want to be a burden on other people. The performance of being okay for other people feels almost like another demand. But isolation compounds burnout significantly. So I'd encourage people to identify even one or two relationships where they can just be genuinely honest, where they don't have to perform, where they don't have to perform this idea of being okay, and just invest in those things for the time being. It doesn't have to be a really big conversation. Just sometimes just being in the presence of somebody who makes you feel safe can be enough.
Yeah, that's very true and very true. And I think I'd add, and this is very much rooted in what I do clinically, that self-compassion, it's not a luxury in burnout recovery. It's a clinical necessity.
Absolutely.
The problem is the self-critical voice that you is usually running loudly, very loudly in burnout people. The problem is it actually prolongs the recovery. So what's really important is to learn to treat yourself with the same kindness that you would offer a good friend who
Mm.
is struggling. It's just one of the most important shifts that can happen in therapy. I'm so into CFT and what it says about compassion. It's so
Yeah.
important. Do
Yeah,
you agree?
absolutely. And really beautifully said, Wendy. For me, it's just entirely consistent with what we see across the entire team here, what I see clinically when I'm working with people. That shift from self-criticism to self-compassion is often one of the absolute most transformative parts of somebody's recovery journey. It sounds so simple, doesn't it? But we both know it's anything but.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've talked a lot about people can do themselves, and I really hope people listen to this and subscribe to this podcast because you've given out so much information about self-help strategies. So thank you so much, there, Ian. The strategies are genuinely very valuable, but I'm just wondering whether burnout may cross the line into territory where professional support is really the best thing for them. And also just maybe to speed up the recovery as well. Because if you're at home struggling, if you go and see a professional person, they can perhaps help you in more ways than you realize. What do you think about that?
Yeah, again, a really good point. And I think there are several markers. I just encourage people to really look out for and to take seriously. The first is duration and trajectory. So if you've been feeling if you've been feeling this way for a long time, maybe months rather than weeks, and you're not seeing any improvements despite making some changes, that's a significant signal to look out for. Burnout that becomes entrenched doesn't tend to just resolve without some form of some sort of structured support. The second is to be looking out for what we might describe as functional impairment. If your capacity to do the things that matter to you is significantly compromised, not just some slight reductions in efficiency, but genuinely struggling to get through your day. Your relationships are beginning to suffer. Your work or your caring responsibilities are feeling unmanageable.
Okay, there's some very
Those are
good
things
points.
to take
Yeah,
seriously.
yeah,
Seriously.
yeah, I hear that. Yeah, very good points there, definitely, and for people to look out for. Is there anything else that you want people to look out for, Ian? I'm just wondering.
Yeah, again, I particularly flag the overlap. We mentioned this a tiny little bit earlier. The overlap with clinical depression. So burnout and depression share a lot of the same features, the exhaustion, the anhedonia, the withdrawal, the negative self-perception. And in some people, burnout progresses into a depressive episode that can need more focused clinical attention. So if that hopelessness becomes a prominent feature, if having thoughts that life maybe isn't worth living, or if you're struggling to see any future in which you feel better, then what I'd really encourage people to do is please do reach out at that point. That's not burnout that a self-help strategy is necessarily going to be able to support you with. And data from the NHS suggests that the average person waits over a year before seeking help for mental health concerns. So that's a year of unnecessary suffering. And I would just ask anyone listening not to let that be their experience or the experience of their loved ones.
Okay, yeah, a good point. And in terms of what professional support can actually offer that self-help can't, what's the difference, would you say?
Yeah, and again, a really important question. And I say there's a few things that are genuinely hard to replicate when you're on your own. The first, just objectivity, that objective perspective. When you're in burnout, your thinking is often significantly distorted, particularly around your own sense of self-worth and your capability. And a good therapist, a good counselor can just help you see yourself and your situation more clearly than maybe you can from the inside. The second thing is that the ability to identify and work with the underlying drivers, the belief systems, the relational patterns, the history that contributed to the burnout occurring in the first place. And without addressing those, recovery can often be temporary. So CBT, which you, Wendy, work with, one of the modalities that you have exceptional experience in, one of the most evidence-based approaches for this, EMDR, again, a therapeutic approach that you work with and the team here work with, can be particularly powerful where burnout is connected to past experiences or where it's connected to some form of trauma. Counselling more broadly can be really helpful in that it provides the space to process. It can help us to make sense of and move through what has happened, which many people find profoundly valuable in of itself.
Yes, accessing support is I would say, a genuine act of self-respect.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
agree with that?
absolutely.
And the people I work with who make the most progress generally are those who decided that they were worth the investment of time and care to themselves, to commit to the therapy, but to commit to getting themselves better. And actually having that as a decision is the start, I think, the beginning of the recovery process, because you're taking responsibility for your own health, well-being, and welfare. And that's step one, isn't it? That's what I would say.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so we've come to the end of today's episode, Ian, and thank you so much for the valuable, rich resources that you've given us as well. Really appreciate that. But perhaps if you could leave our listeners with one thought, one thing you most want them to take away, what would that be?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. And I think what I say is I'd want them to hear this. Burnout is not a character flaw. It is not evidence that you are weak or incapable or not cut out for the life that you've built for yourself. It's what happens when a person with real limits, which is every single one of us, gives more than they have for longer than is sustainable. So if you're burned out, it almost certainly means you've been caring deeply, working hard, showing up for the people who need you. The problem isn't that you cared too much. The problem is that nobody helped you protect your own personal resources whilst you were doing it. And you deserve the same care and attention that you've been giving to everybody else. And it's not too late to start.
That is a really good, very genuine, very important message. And I'm so glad you said that. Now, for anyone listening who perhaps has heard something today that resonates in, can you tell people what support is available through Hope Therapy?
Yeah, absolutely. Hope has a whole team of counsellors. We work with burnout and other contributing factors and resultant things that come from burnout as well. We work right the way across the country. We have a huge amount of free resources on the website. People are very welcome to take a look. www.hopefulminds.co.uk. That's www.hopefulminds.co.uk. We also offer free consultations. So if people want to just speak to one of the team here about what we can offer in a really non-pressurized way where we can just go through in a little bit more detail what somebody's experiencing, and then we can just talk around what type of support can be made available either to them or to a loved one, then they can just go to the website and you can access a free consultation from the website. And you, Wendy, are a hugely experienced psychotherapist. I know that you work with burnout on a very regular basis. So maybe just tell us a little bit about what you offer and how people could reach out to you if they wanted to work with you.
Yeah, so I'm accredited CBT psychotherapist, but CBT covers an awful lot of different range of approaches like mindfulness, compassion focused therapy, acceptance commitment therapy. So there's a wide range of therapies within that sort of title CBT. I'm also an EMDR therapist accredited. So that's really useful if there's any sort of underlying trauma symptoms underneath the burnout as well. And obviously we can talk about that and find out whether that's the case in the first few sessions. So my website is called wendycastellina.com. You can contact me there, you can email me there, and I'm more than happy to talk through anything that you want help with or you think I can support you with. So yeah, I offer a free consultation. Yeah, that is really fantastic. Thank you so much, Ian. And thank you everybody for watching or listening today. And if this episode has been very useful, but if you think it's been very useful to somebody, please share it. You genuinely never know who's in your network might need to hear things that they're experiencing has a name, it's real, and there's a way through it. I just really want to ask people to subscribe to our podcast, and it really helps us build up the resources. So thank you very much, everyone, and please subscribe.
Take care, everyone, and thank you, Wendy.
Bye bye.